Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church into the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Now, here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today, Martha Tatarnic welcomes Canon Alison Milbank to the show. Alison Milbank is Professor of Theology and Literature at the University of Nottingham, where she works in the field of religion and the arts. She's had a particular interest in horror fiction from Daughters of the House in 1992 to God and the Gothic in 2018. She's also published on Dante Reception and on fantasy and religion. She's also an Anglican priest serving canon theologian and priest vicar at Southwell Minster, a cathedral and parish church in a small town near Sherwood Forest. In 2010, with Andrew Davison, she wrote For the Parish, a critique of fresh expressions, and in 2023, The Once and Future Parish, with 6 lectures on the book available on YouTube, which we'll have a link to in the show notes. Associated with the Radical Orthodoxy movement, she co-edited Preaching Radical and Orthodox with John Hughes and Arabella Milbank Robinson. One more thing, please take a moment to leave a review on whatever podcast app you're listening on and share this episode with a friend. Thanks and enjoy the show.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. I am your guest host for this summer season, Martha Tatarnic, and today I am having a conversation across the pond with Professor Alison Milbank. Welcome to the podcast, Alison. I have been following your work for many years, and I'm just thrilled to be able to talk with you today.
It's wonderful to be with you. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you. All right, well, let's just give a little bit of framework for you and your ministry and your life of faith before we get into the meat of our conversation. Maybe you can start by talking a little bit about the faith context in which you grew up.
Well, I grew up in the Church of England, being taken to morning prayer from the age of 2.5. And so originally in the Book of Common Prayer, and then I've grown up through the church and been to every flavour of Anglican church you can think of, from evangelical to Anglo-Catholic, and spent 6 years in the Episcopal Church in America, living in Virginia.
Oh, you did? Okay. I didn't know that piece of the puzzle. That's very cool. So you've spent some time on this side of the Atlantic.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And Church of England, Anglican through and through, it sounds like. No dabbling in other denominations.
No dabbling.
No dabbling. But as you say, there is an extraordinary range of what Anglican churches can look like. So that's very cool. Over the course of that growing up in the Church of England, are there ways in which you have seen being a Christian change from then until now?
Yes, I remember as a child still growing up in a culture defined by Christianity to a great extent. We had a day off from school on Ascension Day, for example, which was typical of all children. I think 1994, when Sunday trading came in, would be a time that I felt was a watershed in terms of secularization.
Okay.
Because there was no longer a separate day which had a particular character, and it changed everything, I think, as much as things like television and other kinds of secularizing things that stopped habits of church going.
Yeah. I think there is kind of a similar dynamic here in Canada in terms of Sunday shopping and just how much that makes being part of a faith community a choice that goes against the grain. You know, it's not something that comes easily, or that society is sort of set up to make part of your habit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that has a great deal to do with secularization. I think it is partly about the way we organize time and space, and inhabit the world. Obviously, there's been aggressive atheism as well, though I think that's passing.
Yeah, I do too.
I think Generation Z is much more open to religion, and also to quite traditional forms of countercultural religion that seem mysterious and different.
Yeah, I kind of see those trends as well, and my kids who are in their teens, they name some of that too. It's interesting. Yeah. So, what has brought you to your current ministry context?
Well, I've always been a priest in secular employment, and see my teaching and research as part of my priestly vocation. I worked formerly in a parish, relatively rural parish, though not that far from the city, an ex-mining area.
Okay.
And I now live in the little cathedral town, and I'm the canon theologian and priest vicar at the cathedral, which is also a parish church, because it is just a small town. So it's our congregation are local, and I do all the kind of things, helping with children's work, baptisms, weddings, that kind of thing.
Wow. Okay. So that sounds like quite a wonderful blend of vocational elements to be able to have that academic life and contributions in that setting, and then also to very much be grounded in a parish setting as well. Yeah, good. You've got you're living the dream.
I sometimes feel as if I'm doing 3 jobs, but
you're living the dream, but it's hard work.
That's right. No, I'm very, very lucky indeed.
Okay. What's a spiritual practice that you are finding meaningful these days?
I think I was talking about space and time. I think pilgrimage is something that I find very, very helpful for my own spiritual practice, because I feel every time you have an aim, you walk to a holy place, you're somehow sacralizing the whole landscape. And it's a way in which you can reach out to people from way beyond organized religion. So it has this kind of missional quality as well. And so it's something I'm trying to develop in my local area.
Okay.
Big way.
So like a pilgrimage with a particular destination can you?
Yes. I mean, the one I did on Palm Sunday, it was also the day of Walter Hilton, who was a 14th century spiritual writer. And he lived just down the road from us in a village called Thurgerton, where he was an Augustinian canon. So we did a Palm Sunday service in Thurgerton with a Walter Hilton element. And then we did a pilgrimage to the cathedral over the fields, where we had evensong and a sermon in honor of Walter Hilton. That's just a local pilgrimage that I have developed.
Oh, okay.
But there are lots and lots of others. I've done a water pilgrimage around the wells, thinking about water justice, lots of local ones. But obviously there are much longer distance ones. I haven't had time to do any of those, but I would love to.
Yeah.
When I have time to do a proper long distance Camino of some sort.
Okay, that's wonderful. And I love how that practice that's meaningful for you is something that is also invitational to others. Yeah, beautiful. Well, thank you for setting a little bit of groundwork for the main topic of our conversation today, which is this wonderful book, The Once and Future Parish. And I think, given that that's the title of the book, The Once and Future Parish, if we can just start out by defining what it is that you mean when you talk about the parish and how that's different from the church in general.
I mean, parish is church in a local context. In the English context, it has a particular geographical manifestation, in that the whole of England is divided up into parishes. And if you're a parish priest, you hold the cure of souls for everybody in that area. And I would even like to develop it in a more ecological direction, as saying you have a responsibility for the whole of nature in that geographical area. So obviously in different parts of the world, it has a slightly more gathered idea. But it's interesting that the emerging church are beginning to discover the idea of parish. And I've seen one or two publications to that effect. So it is very much a kind of open, inclusive idea, which includes everybody in your sort of spiritual embrace in a particular area.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like here in Canada, certainly the Anglican Church very much is centered on that idea of parish as well. And yet it's not exactly how we operate in practice because, you know, people church shop and they go to the parish church that they like the best and often drive by a number of other Anglican churches in order to get to the one that they want to go to. Like, do you see that same dynamic in the UK where there is this working definition, but then there's kind of the practical way that it gets lived out?
I would say in the country, people don't tend to church shop. Even in towns, I thought they did more than they actually do. Res Publica did a report on sort of the social and community contribution of Anglican parishes. And in their surveys, they discovered that most people, I think up to sort of 80% of people going to Anglican churches are going no more than a mile.
Wow.
So it isn't as church shoppy as one tends to think. Though sometimes when you're in a city centre, you will have your big Anglo-Catholic or your big evangelical church. But it is less advanced than we think.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because, you know, a lot of policy, certainly at the beginning of the 20th century, was determined on the idea of the homogeneous unit principle, that people chose, and that's really what they did. Whereas it doesn't seem to be quite as much the case as we used to think.
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. I don't know what the stats would be here, but I can't imagine that it's such a high percentage of people who worship in their local parish. One of the things that I have sort of always found particularly life-giving about the idea of the parish is that, you know, we live in a world of choice, like where you can go to the grocery store and there's about 250 different cereals that you can buy. And, you know, you can choose exactly what fiber content and sugar content and protein content you want for your morning cereal. And you can just about get drowned in sort of all of the consumer choices. To be part of a parish is to get to be chosen, you know, like rather than being the chooser, like you get to be chosen. Like this is where you get to worship because this is where God has planted you. What do you find to be particularly important about that parish idea for the life of faith?
Well, I think exactly as you do. I think the givenness of it is a blessing. And it kind of helps you bring together all your different identities and modes of life and kind of earth them in the sense, as you say, that God has kind of put you there. I do love the mixed character of the parish. Okay, it may be that we're finding it harder to get more and more younger people, but you know, you do have a mixed community. of different ages, different cultures. I was in Leicester a little while ago at an inner city church there. They'd got 21 different nationalities, but they're all there because they all live in this inner city kind of area. And where else would they be brought together? And I feel too that it has this sense that you're in for the long haul, that, that it's the place where you're going to grow in your sacramental life. And the sacraments are these points of encounter and growth, which you do communally. And so there's a kind of communal growing that comes from this plantedness.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think the other component that I think about a lot is, like, who your neighbor is. Like, it's about like the givenness of your community. But it's also the clarity of service, like you are called to serve this particular area in a very rooted sort of way. I was in a conversation with a friend of mine who's part of an evangelical tradition, and he was sort of noting that his church had moved out of the downtown and into a place where they could get a great big piece of land and have a big parking lot. And this is because their church is exploding with people and so on and so forth. But he just sort of reflected to me, like, I don't think that, like, I think we should be where the need is. I think that we should be, like, not just kind of going for the big parking lot. I think that we should be attending to who our neighbor is.
Yeah, and then everything kind of connects too, because people tell you about what's happening, or they tell you who's ill, or then you're in a position to make relationships with all the other kinds of faith communities, different kinds of need, as you say, with the local council, people in the local pubs and cafes. Your life becomes more integrated. That helps everybody's mental health, apart from anything else, as well as their happiness and their effectiveness, because they know what's going on. They really know what the need is because of the quality of relationships that you have. If you just work outwards, it's a kind of orientation. It's not a kind of closing in of boundaries.
Yeah.
So much like a kind of compass.
Yeah, compass. I like that. And I like that word integrated, because it is such a response to the dislocation that I think can really haunt modern secular life. And, we're going to get to talking more in depth about how the parish is a response to some of the greatest needs in our world today. But I think that sense of integration and anchoring is a huge piece of that response.
And I mean, all the academic research shows this.
Yeah, like not just religious academic research, but like psychological research. And yeah, for sure. Now, like, spoiler alert, your book very much walks us through how this idea of parish, as much as the two of us could sing its praises all day, evidently, how the idea of the parish actually is significantly under threat. So maybe you can walk us through some of those dynamics that are threatening the centrality of the parish in the life of the church. And I was surprised and intrigued by one of the first dynamics that you identified, which is this religionless Christianity.
Yeah. So in my book, I'm not looking at the external forces of secularization so much as the way, as Charles Taylor puts it, good Canadian, secularization runs through us. and in particular our institutions. And obviously it's a long story, but one key step for me is the way that certainly in England, but I think probably also in other Anglophone countries and Germany as well, the late prison writings of Dietrich Bonhoeffer actually affected the way we think about the church. Now, in many ways, Bonhoeffer is regarded as a saint because of his opposition to Nazism and his death. And I am full of admiration for him as well. But in prison, he talks a little bit about religionist Christianity, by which he means he tends to think of religion as what human beings do.
Right.
Their rituals, their practices. And he's a good Lutheran. So for him, what really matters is God's action. And he sort of separates those two. And he thinks that so compromised is the church because of Nazism that in the future we need to do away. I mean, he doesn't really articulate this in a very developed way because he's just in prison and it's, throwaway remarks. But these were taken in the 1960s, particularly by John Robinson in his book Honest to God and South Bank Religion, as saying that kind of humanity has come of age. Religion is somehow a kind of crutch, and that we need to throw it away and embrace the secular. And the practice of this, and this can be demonstrated, Mark Chapman in a particularly fine essay has actually excavated the little magazines and things where all this was discussed. And it does mean that you begin to think that people who go to church have got some kind of psychological problem. But really the future lies in embracing the culture, embracing the secular. And the really weird way is that this defines liberal Christianity in the decades ahead, where the secular writes the agenda, but also certain forms of charismatic evangelicalism as well. So the emerging church itself thinks that it emerges out of this particular culture, and the idea of church culture has no value at all. And I think the effect of this over time has been to develop a belief that our traditions, our practices, our liturgies, our ways of doing things are of the past and irrelevant. And so I think this lies behind, I've listened to sermons about this umpteen times throughout my life. And I do think that it's been internalized all the way through, and it continues, though it is particularly strong among retired clergy of about between 70 and 90.
Yeah. I think that very much tracks, and I think you're absolutely right that it is so internalized that it was never even interrogated. Like it just, I remember a mentor of mine early on saying that she hoped that that eventually, if she was really doing her job well, she would eventually work herself out of a job. Like this idea that the parish church is sort of a stopgap or a crutch or something that we're using until, we don't need it anymore.
The kingdom, the use of kingdom language is quite interesting. People keep talking nowadays about building the kingdom. As if you build the kingdom, in my view, you get the Tower of Babel. The kingdom is not that kind of thing. It's not something that we can just bring about.
Yeah.
But it's part of this whole way in which the secular is baptized as somehow really where the Holy Spirit is at. Now, I'm not trying to limit the Holy Spirit's work for a moment.
Right.
But it's not the same thing as denying. It's almost you're denying the church itself, and you kind of blame the church almost for existing. And it means that you're no longer doing your liturgies, your practices with confidence. I've actually listened to sermons where people say, well, you may not go to church. You're on your own spiritual quest. That's fine.
Yeah. 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 And, like, it is true, you don't need to go to church to be a good person. Like, that is true. But I don't think that was ever particularly on the table about what we thought we were about. Like, it's not about being a good person. It's
about doing what Christ told us to do,
Yeah. Yeah.
This in remembrance of me.
Yeah.
Pray like this.
Yeah. If you
baptized.
If you want to love and serve God, you have to figure out how to love and serve your neighbor. And here's a really life-giving way of figuring that out,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. I do see that sort of embarrassment about who we are, being quite strong in the life of the Anglican Church anyway.
And I'm not talking about an opposite triumphalism either, but a kind of faithfulness and truthfulness to who we are, which can still be transformative both for individuals but also for churches. I've watched it. If I'd had more time to do my book, it was going to have case studies of particular parishes where they are managing to do the traditional in a transformative way and to serve their neighbor.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's the next volume. One of the other pieces that you really detail is sort of around a creeping managerialism in the life of the Church of England. And, your book is very a specific examination of financial choices and structural choices in the church in England. But I wanted to have you on the podcast because I think that that some of those dynamics really do hold sway across denominations and cultural contexts. I certainly see a lot of those dynamics present here in Canada in a variety of our denominations. Is that, a response to decline, secularism, all of the anxiety that sort of goes with that in terms of the church's survival, gets funneled into a very bureaucratic response. And if we just structure ourselves better, if we just kind of invest more in managing and strategizing, then maybe we can bail out the sinking boat, I think is sort of the idea. Why do you feel that bureaucracy is appealing as an answer to decline?
Well, I think you're right that it is anxiety. One bishop told me, you do stay up at night worrying about, how you're going to pay the bills.
Yeah.
It's a bit different for us in the Church of England because we do actually have money, but that's another story. So I think it is anxiety, but I think if you've lost trust in yourself as an institution and what it is you're aiming at, your absolute aim, which is to preach the gospel and celebrate the sacraments, then medium aims like efficiency, the so-called SMART goals, become your end aims.
Yeah.
Or they require all sorts of kinds of instantiation and targets have to be proved and people have to be there to check you've done the targets. So that builds up a whole kind of culture, so that we have, obviously there are ones that all institutions are prone to: health and safety, safeguarding. And not for a moment saying we don't need to keep people safe, but it's almost as if safeguarding itself has become its own kind of ends, and it isn't actually doing the job. That's what's really so tragic, that we're putting in place. And then if you think that the answer is always new initiatives, well, new initiatives seem to grow their own bureaucracies, mission enablers, job titles that nobody can really understand. They seem to have to be rolled out, and then they need targets and they need checking. And so you lose touch with your kind of core activities, and they go by the by. It's a very old-fashioned kind of managerialism, which really dates from the 1980s.
Yep.
Still performs sometimes. I mean, there's a company in Britain called Wilko, where when they were failing, they put far too much money into the centre and took all the money out of the shops where they were trying to sell things. And as a result, they just imploded. And I think the same thing will happen with the church, because instead of actually funding properly the work, where actually you raise the money, because I don't know about your church, it's probably the same as mine, but in the Church of England, the parishes pay for themselves. Nobody else pays money to keep these historic buildings going unless they can apply for grants.
Yeah, exactly.
They raise their money for that. They raise the money for their clergy, by and large. There's some money for poor parishes. But the Church of England's decided to take most of the money it used to give to parishes out and put it into sort of glitzy new mission activities. So the poorer parishes are the income stream. And actually, if they were going to be efficient, that's where they should be putting their money, because that's what they get a return. But instead, it all goes into the central bureaucracy. And then that doesn't actually produce any money. So even on its own instrumental grounds, it's failing, sadly. And it just makes people in the parish really angry, because if you're a church warden or elder, I don't know what the term is in the Canadian church, you have more and more bureaucracy to deal with at that level. So getting volunteers then becomes more difficult. So part of me genuinely doesn't understand quite why they are so fixated on this old model, particularly when really up to the minute kind of businesses are much more relational and horizontal. I'm not really able to give you an answer, except that I think they're accepting a kind of economy of lack. And my own view is that mission and evangelism and ministry and everything should always be seen out of a kind of fullness of God's gifting. Even if, you're struggling, you should somehow live through that fullness, not through feeling that everything is limited and that's how you're going to act.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as you said, like, it is so connected to that crisis of confidence that what we have is something a little embarrassing and outdated and not that important, and then you sort of go grasping at straws, trying to see a success model somewhere else that might give the answers. But yeah, there is a certain lack of coherence about it.
I mean, in Britain, it's very, they send the bishops on little MBAs. But one of the people who was teaching them is somebody called Paula Venables, and she was head of the post office. And you may not know this in Canada and America, but our post office is the center of a scandal where lots of postmasters were accused falsely of of taking money out, and it was just the computer system. But the institution so trusted the centre and saw its reputation as all that mattered, that it let these people go to prisons, people committed suicide, all because they were working through smart goals, which privileged the centre, valued the centre, and end up, instead of thinking we're there to deliver letters or parcels, think we're there to support the institution and its central manifestation. And I fear that's the way we've gone, certainly in the Church of England.
One of my favorite quotations in the book was from the Bishop of Chelmsford, talking about strategic plans. And I am notoriously not good at strategic plans. Like, I'm good at figuring out a next step. Like, I'm good at keeping momentum going because I can usually figure out what we need to do next. But like, 5-year plans just throw me into a complete tizzy. Anyway, so the bishop says, the language of vision and strategy risks ignoring the reality of frailty, brokenness, and sin, and that everyone following the same program is not the only way. What do you think we need to be wary of with strategic plans and vision documents as a response to uncertainty in the church?
I think the problem with them is their grandiose nature, and the fact that they're not embedded in experience. I think there is some value to a parish community, or even a deanery, or even a diocese, doing really deep knowing and investigation of where they are, where the points of need are, where the points of support are needed. But again, as you say, that's just, if you've got your proper gospel goals, if you know what I mean, then you just move gently in a more incarnational way where you are, discerning need, building relationships, finding out what you can do in small ways. And so you can have plans, but as soon as you have grandiose ones, then you're into targets and the language of growth. And all that is just like the law in St. Paul. It just sort of sets you up to fail. Because things change. You say 5 years, a huge amount can change. Just think back 5 years. We had, the COVID pandemic in the middle of that, not to mention in my country, and I'm sure around the world, the cost of living crisis, wars. 5 years, so much changes that you're best to have your proper telos and then your deep knowing, and you're moving to plan, as you say, the next step. Always having a focus on the wider picture and the wider need. But the fact that they are not embedded, I think, is the real problem. It's just like, I was telling you before the broadcast of this little black majority church in South London, St. John's Earlsfield. They had a mission plan, bless their hearts, a very little church, but they had plans for reaching out to the social housing beyond them, and they were getting on with this. And they were also had a food bank where people who were in need could come. And it got so big, they shared it with another church. What does the diocese do? It applies for a big strategic fund to allow a great big church from another area in London to take over their church. And what are they going to do? What's their big plan? To start a food bank. They hadn't noticed. This little church has already got one. The fact it's not in the building is it outgrew them, and they're now sharing it. And what's better thing than to be actually sharing this kind of work and growing it? But that's because they were just embedded and they knew what was needed. Whereas these people, their plan were just on paper. And they'd done no talking to the local people whatsoever or consultation. And that's what's wrong with these big clans, I think. They're far too colonialist in their mode of working.
Yeah. Colonialism, hasn't been shown to have worked all that well, but we're still pretty invested in it. I like that word, embedded. I think that's really important. And I mean, I think too, like, if we take anything from our sacred stories, like, it's that God rarely sort of shows up and does the thing that we're expecting. Like,
Jesus does potted around a very, very small area. If you've ever visited the Holy Land, you realise he could practically, well, he did walk it, but it was, he didn't do very grandiose kind of projects.
No, doesn't, not grandiose at all. Yeah. I think that one of the things that I found challenging in your book, I mean, there's a lot of, I think, challenging takeaways, but, you call into question the move towards closing small, struggling parish churches and investing in church centers that can serve a wider area. I think that in our denomination anyway, that has been considered for a long time to be an important way forward in terms of increasing secularization and diminishing resources. That if we can invest in fewer buildings and build stronger teams, then we have a better shot of being able to really serve our communities rather than just be struggling to keep the doors open, which isn't super life-giving for communities of faith, just to be trying to keep the lights on. But as I said, you kind of call that into question as a strategy. I'm wondering, like, do you see ways in which you do think it's important for the church to consider restructuring as we, live in a time where there are fewer people wanting to participate in a community of faith?
Well, we tried teams in the Church of England in the 60s and 70s, and they were genuinely very unpopular, both with the clergy and the people. So they more or less, I mean, there's still one or two here and there, but they basically failed as a model. Recently, the Church of England has done some surveys, and those surveys have found that the relationship between the priest and the people, the closer it is, the more likely you are to have success. The Church of England's first big pastoral reorganisation on this centralising model was in Wigan, in the north of England, a sort of poor northern ex-mill town. They poured money into it to allow this to happen because it always takes a lot of bureaucracy. But the idea was to move away from parishes into hubs, to centralize clergy, to centralize funeral ministry. It's been an utter failure. Congregations fell by a third during this period. Money contributions fell by a third. Deanery money fell eightfold. The funeral taxi rank system was appalling, and people really missed. Lay people often were the people who in the local church would organize funerals. But again and again, you found people who were being buried, church people being buried by strangers. In this system. And so there was an independent report about it, and it was so negative that rumour has it that the Church of England is hoping to try and organise another report so that they can make it look better. But I mean, that's just the first example that started, I think, in about 2012. I spoke to the rector of Wigan, who retired. The irony was the clergy realised that they needed to work together more closely, and they'd been meeting together and having Bible study and talking about how it could be managed and still have that relationality without over-centralization. But when it happened, all that was just by the by, they took them to a posh hotel and just told them what was going to happen. Oversight ministry is the answer, and it means that you have a priest as a kind of manager, managing a lay team. And priests don't go into priesthood mainly to become oversight ministers. They want hands-on ministry. So it's going to be, it's already quite difficult to recruit for these kinds of jobs. We did a survey too. I belong to an organization called Save the Parish, which the name is on the tin. But we did survey ordinands to see how many of them were being prepared for oversight ministry, about a third. And then how many of them saw themselves as oversight ministers in the future. And I think the answer was about 0.1%.
Wow.
So I don't think it's really going to work. Now, there is a problem, but I think the problem, okay, we've got secularization and so numbers are falling. But if you've got a church that doesn't value priesthood, and our church is, in England anyway, is more and more wanting to so value lay ministry that they're not making it feel that, why would anybody want to be a priest? You don't value it. You give them impossible jobs. If you're centralizing more and more ministry, you're not going to be able to have the relationships with people where you could find out whether they've got vocations to the priesthood. So it's a vicious circle that you're not going to have enough priests to do these jobs. So we wouldn't really kind of start from there, but clergy are being attracted to the diocese in England anyway, where parish ministry is still operating. And those include some of the poorest.
Right.
Like Bern, which is still, despite its poverty, committed to parochial ministry. And Chichester, London, Edmondsbury and Ipswich, there are a number that are not going down this route because we know all the evidence shows that it leads to further decline. Now, it may be different for you in a slightly, I know you've still got the parish system, but it's probably slightly more gathered in the way it operates. I don't know.
Yeah. I'm sure that there are differences. And for example, like I'm in a city of 130,000 with 7 or 8 Anglican churches, which is a lot of resources going into a lot of buildings. And so the questions around what is a faithful restructuring in St. Catharines, where I am, is quite different from the more rural parts of Canada, where if you close a parish church, like people don't have another option of where to go. You're simply kind of removing that Christian witness from that community.
But Wigan was about, I think Wigan may be a bit smaller than, I'm not sure, maybe about the same. That was an urban example. All the research shows that urban areas, people are just as, they're just as, well, in fact, in Wigan, they thought of all the little different bits of Wigan are thought of as sort of individual communities, often centered around an original mill.
Right.
So they had a work center. So I would suggest that the evidence, certainly from my side of the Atlantic, is that this will not necessarily help at all. And in fact, keeping a church going, it can be a burden, but it can be thought of almost as an opportunity. It can go both ways, depending how it's managed, how, what the nature of the challenge. It can itself be missional. For example, one church near me that was facing closure partly because of the cost of keeping it up. The threat of closure actually brought all sorts of people who don't even go to church to come together to actually assure its future. both as building and as a community. I mean, I think buildings matter. I think buildings are wholly missional. I do not think of them as baggage, which is what the moderator of the Church of Scotland, where I regret to say that's the Presbyterian Church, which is the established church in Scotland, is about to close 300 or 400 churches with huge social consequences.
Yeah. Yeah.
Really
huge social consequences for sure. And, we've had recent conversations on this podcast about those consequences as we lose social space. That in most cases, when those buildings are gone, is redeveloped into for-profit, condominiums or, various other commercial spaces, and what is lost to the fabric of communities when those social spaces are gone for good. It's I think I certainly grew up in an age where our buildings were considered baggage, and you don't, like, the church is not a building, and it's not. The church is a community, but buildings can be a remarkable resource of ministry and gathering, and
they tell people that God is stable and cares for them, and that their area has value and matters. I mean, even before you talk about the fact that they are gathering places where, you have space where you can hold an electoral meeting, you can, bring people together. It's a place people can go to for help.
Yeah. You can have recovery groups and food banks and karate dojos and sort of all kinds of amazing things that serve the community in very real ways, feeding programs. And again, it's this, I think it matters that in the heart of our community is a place where prayer is lifted up and offered, and that the sacraments are seen as benefiting not just the people who are gathered there, that, when we lift up the bread and wine, we're not just lifting up the needs of our own community who's physically there, like we're lifting up the needs of the world. And we've got to believe that prayer matters, that it has spiritual ramifications for whether or not it's happening in the heart of our communities.
Otherwise, we should just go home and have a cup of tea or something stronger.
Yeah, right? Like,
it doesn't matter.
Absolutely. I mean, I absolutely could not be with you more on that. My last book is called Why Gather? And like, we need to know that there are compelling reasons why this matters, other than, just sort of inherited baggage. Yeah. So I've served as an ordained parish priest for the past 20 years. It's not what I would have chosen to do with my life. I wanted to go into law, but I felt called to do this in a way that I didn't really feel I could say no to. There are lots of ways in which I feel like I'm unequal to the task. I have to rely on God's grace regularly in order to be in a sort of ministry that has me do things like get up in pulpits and preach sermons and be much more extroverted than I naturally am, and all of those things. I have found lots of times where, carrying the weight of people's grief and anxiety, burying people I love, it can all feel like it is too much. I've definitely taken on the Messiah complex at times in parish ministry and believed that if I just worked harder and longer and smarter, then I'd be able to save the institutional church. During COVID, I mostly just was looking for another option for what I could do with my life. And yet, having said all of that and being transparent and honest about the challenges, I have to say that 20 years in, I believe myself to be fortunate, blessed beyond measure, to be able to be a parish priest, and that it is sort of the greatest joy and privilege alongside all of those challenges that I get to walk with a local embodied community of faith. And I say all the time that my faith is stronger because of the people that I get to serve with in the parish church. So I'm pretty convicted of the idea that the local community of faith, the parish, is a profoundly life-giving response to the biggest challenges our world faces right now. And certainly that's where I hear you landing in this book as well, is that the parish has been threatened. It hasn't been valued in terms of how we talk or in terms of how we resource it. But it matters. Like, the parish matters, and it matters in a way that is not just important for those of us who like church. It matters for the sake of the world. So can you just talk a little bit about that future part of the title of your book, the once and future church? How do you see the parish as offering that life-giving response to the needs of the world?
Well, I do feel that was very moving, what you said, and I think a lot of people would resonate with you. I think a lot of people priests have become quite tired and weary and discouraged. And our parishes in many places do need reviving.
Yeah.
But I think they do speak to the moment. I mean, we've already spoken about mental health. We've already spoken about food banks and debt relief, all the things that work with the homeless or the social benefit. I think the sense that they're a kind of laboratory for a different kind of selfhood, a different way of existing in relation is really important. And I think, I mean, the lockdown and COVID led to a great deal of home working, but I think the future lies very much, if only because of the ecological emergency, in people living a more sustainable life where their work and their life and their school are more integrated. I think that's the way things are going. I mean, young people are moving out of our cities in my country just because they can't afford to live in.
Yeah, that's true.
So I think big chain stores in big out-of-town shopping centres are beginning to close as shopping goes online, whereas small shops to do with local provenance are doing better, if not. So I think the future, oddly, is that we will be living more locally. But I think that is of such inestimable benefit to us that it's good, even if it is for lots of negative reasons that we're doing it. But I think we talked about the alienation of people, their sense of atomization. And I think living in the secular is not where anybody really wants to be, even if they don't want to embrace Christian faith. They want to inhabit a kind of re-enchanted world where space becomes place, where time becomes gift, not just something you're always running away, a place where we can be physically present to each other and actually begin to imagine a juster, more loving world. And I think parish has enormous potential for that. And I think too, I am very ecologically interested. My own church sees ecology as a matter of targets. Churches have got to become carbon neutral by a certain date. They're making hardly any, they only put their boiler on once a week, But I do think that if we are to save the world, it will come out of that kind of parochial thinking, whereby you value local plants. You want to save things because they're part of where you live. And so it comes out of a positive kind of apprehension rather than a kind of negative one. Again, it's like mission. I'm saying it should come out of something positive rather than out of lack, which is how we get the managerialism. So I think the parish is a place of reordering imagination, a place of living more sustainably, a place of living in relation. And I think if the church is to survive, even the vulnerability of the modern parish is an opportunity.
Yeah.
Because it forces you to make relationships with the local mosque, with the trade unions, with the co-op, with anything that's going on locally. Because alone, you can't do it. And too often, because of the church's power in the past, we felt that we can do everything and we can't. So I think even that vulnerability and precariousness is a gift that I think the parish can offer.
Yeah.
Even its problem.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully said and very true. I mean, it is a point of contact with a whole world that's feeling quite vulnerable and shaken up by the various transitions that we're living through, and we can very much come alongside in that shaking up. We can offer a very life-giving alternative and a witness to the things that are true about our human lives, which is that, like, we are integrated. Like, there is no way biologically of being alive without being in a pretty intimate relationship with the earth and air and nutrients and other bodies around you. And we've tried to live apart from that truth very unsuccessfully. So yeah, there's a calling back to central truths that are very much embodied in the life of the parish. Well, let's take a break and the portion of our podcast on that note. We'll come back for some closing questions in a moment. Welcome back to the Future Christian Podcast. And we're here for some closing questions as we finish today's conversation. Now, Alison, we always tell our guests that these closing questions can be taken as seriously or not as you want. It's up to you. But have some fun with them. If you were Pope for a day, Alison, what would that day look like?
Gosh, I don't think I'd make any pronouncements. I think I'd just sit in my cathedra. I'm not quite sure where Pope Francis' cathedra is because St. Peter's is a basilica. But anyway, I'd sit there and I'd just let people come and ask me questions. And I'd hope that would give an example as what I think church leaders should spend their time doing. It's what the Coptic Pope does once a week. When I visited the Copts, he just sits in his seat and people come and talk to him.
Oh, that's lovely. Yeah. I think being wary of pronouncements that's a good rule of thumb for that day. You probably have some pretty interesting conversations. If you could talk with a theologian or historical Christian figure, bring them back to life, to have some conversation, who would you want to meet?
I'd like to meet Dionysius the Areopagite, or as he's called nowadays, Dionysius the pseudo Areopagite. He's named after St. Paul's Athenian convert, but he was probably a 6th century Syrian theologian. He's really, really influential. His mystical theology is behind a lot of the kind of mysticism in the church, but nobody knows who he is or anything about him. And yet he's one of the most captivating, imaginative theologians that there is. So I'd like to know who he really was, what country he came from.
Okay, well, that's a unique answer, and I think you're right. Lots of people are not going to know anything about him. So,
Mystical Theology is a good read. It's very short.
Okay, that's a good plug. Thank you. What will history remember from our current time and place?
Oh dear, I'm going to be a bit negative. Sorry.
That's okay.
I think decadence.
Ah.
I think the loss of faith in the church is a sign of decadence. I think we've got a complete loss of nerve in church leadership, in government, which has also become just management, and that's true throughout the world.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a loss of trust in institutions, which themselves have lost a sense of the common good. I'm a great believer in the common good. And we've got a liberalism, which I think is completely illiberal in its operation. So I think people will look back and think we were bonkers.
Yeah.
To be quite honest. I don't want to get into lots of, sort of woke, anti-woke kind of discussions, but I just think people will think that the way we went about things was really bizarre.
Yeah. What were they thinking? So what are your hopes for the future of Christianity?
I just hope we keep faithful, that we hold to our gospel, to our traditions, our practices, however powerless we become. But I think we said at the beginning, I think the tide is turning. I think new movements often begin with elites, and we're seeing novelists, musicians, sort of celebrated people turning back to faith. And I think that will be the beginning of what I hope will be a return by more people. I do think Generation Z is less hostile. And in York, for example, I discovered a large number of young people are going to churches in the centre of town where they just use the Book of Common Prayer, for example.
Huh?
I'm not saying that's the only worship that has value, but I think it's interesting that, that there are people looking for beauty and depth and meaning in faith.
Mm-hmm.
And I have great hope. I don't think it will hurt us to be precarious and vulnerable.
Yeah.
I hope it does make us more faithful.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that if faithfulness can be an outcome of that vulnerability, that's a pretty great thing. Where can people find more about you, Alison?
Well, I don't do social media.
You don't do it? Okay.
No, and even the Wikipedia page, somebody once did one about me, but I think it's really out of date. The books, I suppose, my monograph, my most recent monograph, God and the Gothic, my articles, I've written on imaginative apologetics, all sorts of things. So there's quite a lot out there.
Okay, so lots to engage more and read more, but they're not going to find you on TikTok.
Sorry. Might be going. Oh, dear.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation today. Thank you for your extraordinary work. Thank you for engaging this topic with our listeners. I'm very, very grateful. We always end our podcasts with a word of peace. So the peace of God be with you, Alison.
And also with you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romig-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.